Hello, World Singers. My name is Brooke.
And I'm Tyler.
And this is
Cosmere Conversations. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another fantastic episode that we have prepared for us. It's research time here in the Cosmere Conversations community.
We are talking about the Unmade, and I can't believe we haven't done another episode about the Unmade until now. I went back in our notes archive, and our first Unmade episode is like episode 13, I think, and we're all the way at 152, so it's been a while. And we've learned a lot, and I think this is something we're gonna get a little bit of resolution on in Wind and Truth with the exploration of Ba Ado Mishram and maybe a little bit of resolution to that story. But I think the more we uncover about the Unmade, the more we're going to crack open both answers and questions to a bunch of other things.
That's what we love here. A little bit of answers, a lot more questions. And just like last week's episode on the Heralds, I think this one is going to stand the test of time, really serve as a resource for everyone to come back to when they need some knowledge about the Unmade, because there's a lot we know. There's a lot we don't know. We are going to try to put it all in this one place. And if you appreciate what we do here, go ahead and hit that like button. Do a little bit of commenting on whatever app you happen to be listening to us on. Maybe leave a review. Say some nice things. 5 stars only. I don't really care about the other star levels. But I think that one of the great things here, you just said 152 episodes that we've done, another 70 plus episodes over on the Patreon exclusive feed. None of them have any advertisements.
This is correct.
You can get that Cosmere knowledge, sweet, sweet drip, no interruptions. I think that's pretty cool, and I think you should rate and review us, keeping that in mind.
Okay, what are the Unmade? Let's just start with this seemingly simple question. What are the Unmade?
In 2015, there's a word of Brandon that says, the Unmade are splinters of Odium. And we have had many discussions here about what are splinters, what are slivers of infinity, and how do Spren or type 2 invested entities versus type 1. We've had all of these conversations.
There are so many different kinds and different levels of invested entities. I think sometimes they're a little bit hard to keep track of. So just as a reminder, a splinter is a significant measure of a shard's power that has been separated from the main body of investiture.
And while I was going to make a very simple statement there, we immediately began having a back and forth that went on for 12 minutes off mic because we couldn't even agree what a splinter was. So I'm going to hit us with some of the examples that we just talked about, and just to see all the differences, because one, and the most numerous, are the Spren of Roshar.
Yes, Spren are splinters. There are different sizes of Spren, and therefore different sizes of splinters.
This is where I started to get like nitpicky, and I was saying, no, only the elevated or radiant Spren could count as splinters, and that's
incorrect.
Yes, exactly. They're all Spren, and including these Unmade, they're all just like variations of the singular concept of a splinter. We're seeing it reflected in different ways, seeing it through different perspectives, through different magic systems. When we jump over to different worlds, the Scions from Cell. What about some other examples?
On Komashi, we see the spirits, which are splinters of virtuosity.
And I think that it's kind of debatable if all of the different avatars of autonomy count as splinters. I kind of think yes, especially like the island of Pat G, which is said to be like given a piece of autonomy's power.
I think that there is maybe a distinction in how closely tied the piece of power still is to the shard. If the shard still has the ability to like manipulate and control the piece of power, I don't think it counts as a splinter, and that's maybe what avatars are. Autonomy is still acting through their avatars. Their avatars, I don't think, are like acting completely of their own choice. And I think to be a splinter, the splinter must have autonomy.
Yeah,
not
there's
to make
a separation.
things confusing,
Yeah,
but right. Yes, that piece of power needs to be its own thing. So it started out as a piece of honor or a piece of odium, but as we're going to talk about in just a moment, some of these splinters of odium are no longer following odium's will.
Exactly. So that autonomy, not to be confused with the shard who's making
agency,
avatars.
maybe we should say.
That's a great distinction.
Confusion.
Yeah. So we'll use the word agency when we are talking to not confuse with autonomy, because we think what autonomy is doing is not actually creating splinters.
Yes.
Just to be confusing.
Because their avatars do not have agency.
We think that the majority of information that exists about the Unmade is coming from the very few encounters that we see in the text and from the Mythica, which is the in-world book written by Hessia that cites 9 different Unmade. And Shallan questions that. She says there's other reports that there's 10.
Yeah, and I think that that's just an important thing for us to remember, because as an in-world text, we have to take everything that it says with a grain of salt, knowing that the characters in-world may have information that we as readers don't have, but may also be wrong about things that we as readers know.
And let me continue, and you can just give yes or no's to some of these, because I want to elevate the question now to like the type 2 invested entities. These would be more of our cognitive shadows. Heralds. Are they splinters?
No.
The returned from Nalthis, Court of the Gods.
Returned, I believe, contain a splinter, which is their divine breath, but they are also cognitive shadows. So, like, I don't know, does that count as a splinter, since the divine breath itself, as far as we know, is not exerting its own agency? It's just inside of the returned.
But it might be pushing them to accomplish that one true goal, that design of endowment, because there is like a purpose,
maybe.
And their purpose comes from maybe the divine breath. But I think these are kind of the questions that are still up in the air. It's like, what happens if you take a splinter, a significant measure of the shard's power, and then attach it to something else, either a cognitive shadow?
I guess you could say that a splinter is one of the things that enables a soul to become a cognitive shadow, because a cognitive shadow is created when the soul is so invested that it's able to persist beyond death.
And that could be done, that investing could be done with the splinter.
Correct. Yeah.
Got you.
Maybe this is a bonus episode that we'll do for our patrons. We'll do like a little Cosmere dictionary breakdown for all these terms.
Yeah, because there's a bunch of S words that I get confused by.
Yeah.
And I think the Unmade is a version of what we have seen before. They're weird. They are outside the norm, but they also fit. And it's just like we have some of the corners of the puzzle piece, but we can't see the other side of the puzzle piece. And so we're not sure where it fits in the overall scheme. But that's what I hope this episode can help us do. Give a little bit more context to the Unmade. And we see even within the beings, the splinters that are defined as Unmade, there's great variation.
Yes, correct. Hessie, in her book Mythica, says, quote, "My research into the Unmade has convinced me that these things were not simply spirits of the void or 9 shadows who moved in the night. They were a specific kind of spren endowed with vast powers," end quote. And just as a reminder, because we have another kind of vocabulary word here, what is a spren? If an Unmade is a kind of spren, spren are splinters. They are, quote, "fragments of the powers of creation that have gained sentience through the influence of sapient beings on Roshar," end quote. So pieces of power, in this case, pieces of odium that have gained some level of sentience. As you said, there's differentiation between the individuals here. Some of the Unmade are less sentient than others. Some are quite sentient. So spectrum there. But I think the important thing for us to remember is because the Unmade are Spren, a certain kind of Spren, they have been and are still being influenced by the sapient beings on Roshar.
Exactly. They can't separate themselves from that vortex of thought that is coming from the sapient world. And I believe that is going to be important and is an aspect of like they are bound to Roshar because they are made from the thoughts of the people of Roshar.
Yeah, and if we think about the kind of Spren that we've seen or we see frequently on Roshar, we don't see a whole lot of super negative Spren. There's anticipation Spren, sure, there's fear Spren, there's pain Spren, but I think there's arguments to be made for all of those things that those emotions can have a positive effect on a person. They're not exclusively a negative
Yeah, we learned that in Inside Out too, with the introduction of anxiety.
Yeah. Perhaps the Unmade are those kind of purely negative concepts or emotions that humans and singers can have, like battle lust and hedonism and the things that are so far on the end of the spectrum that there's not really a positive. And so they are, or they have been powered by this more, at least as we see it, negative power of Odium.
This gives us so much to explore, and I think it's important to also remember that Ja'anat said they were made and then unmade.
Yes.
And this pushes me into viewing the fractal nature that Brandon has set up so often. We're dealing with a character, but actually we're dealing with a planet size. Oh, actually we're dealing with a Cosmere size, and everything that exists on the small scale exists on the big scale. I'm wondering if honor and cultivation, or the shards in general, repeatedly did these types of, we'll call them experiments, to create, to make things. And the prime example of creation is maybe ruin and preservation, creating a human species from nothing and having them live on Scadrial. But more often what is happening, what we know did happen across the Cosmere, is that the shards arrived and then started to influence the sapient creatures that lived in those vicinities.
And speaking of this relationship, perhaps, between the Unmade who were once made and honor and cultivation, we know that honor and cultivation made a Spren child that we call the sibling. And I'm going to go back to my bone that I just can't let go of, which is that if they are a sibling, that means that they have brothers, sisters, nibblings. They have other children. Like, you can't be a sibling if you're an only child.
That is the downside for the only children, is that they will never be a sibling. And
so are their siblings the Unmade, or were their siblings the Unmade? Seems so likely to me, but we hear in the text from, I believe, Ja'anat, that she refers to the sibling more like her cousin.
Rather than an actual
sibling, which makes sense if they are splinters of Odium. Then, they're kind of like, oh, we're basically the same thing. We're just from a different shard.
Let's quickly go over to a description from the diagram, and we'll hit a couple of these different descriptions that we've seen. We have, quote, "The Unmade are a deviation, a flare, a conundrum that may not be worth your time. You cannot help but think of them. They are fascinating. Many are mindless, like the spren of human emotions, only much more nasty. I do believe a few can think, however," end quote. And that, again, is from the diagram. When we're talking about the sibling in context of the Unmade, are they related? Yeah, they're cousins, but maybe that distinction is made because of the unmaking process. They would have been siblings, and then they got kind of changed by Odium, and that made them more like cousins.
Right, because as we'll talk about, the process of unmaking involves infusing the thing with the power of a shard.
Right.
Or, I mean, I guess in this case, specifically the power of Odium.
I think this is going to be the defining feature that we really uncover, is like this process of unmaking. And we'll learn more about it in Wind and Truth. But I feel like it is right in line with other weird conundrums, to use a word from the diagram, within Roshar that we know exist, but we don't know why they exist or how they exist in context.
Yeah.
I'll give two on what I think are either sides of the Unmade. We have Kusiketch, the big, large fish-like spren in the Eerie City. And we have the Stormfather. In my estimation, both spren, one of the storms, one of the sea, for lack of a better description. And one elevated maybe in the past to do a simple thing like protect the people of this bay, help them out, empowered over time by the people and their prayers to Kusiketch, but not fundamentally changed or altered. The Stormfather definitely fundamentally changed and altered on purpose by Honor at the end of his life.
Correct.
And kind of like forcefully made him into a new thing.
Yes.
And so I think like there are these big spren who don't necessarily need to be changed, but could be changed.
Sure.
Stormfather could have been changed. He had the potential to be made into something greater. And he was made into what we now see the Stormfather as, this quasi version of Honor. And I think maybe the reason Honor knows he can do it with the Stormfather is because he already did it with the Maid, him in cultivation, elevating spren.
Oh, you think they were already spren? And
like
then
Kusiketch.
Honor and cultivation infused them.
Yes, lifted them up.
Okay, so this is my question that's kind of philosophical.
Okay.
Does it count as unmaking if Honor and or cultivation do the same thing? So Rabaniel attempts to unmake the sibling by infusing the tower with void light.
Okay.
And we say that's unmaking. Presumably, sort of this negative connotation because it's from Odium. Is it only from Odium? Like, is it only unmaking if the power of Odium is being infused into something? Or would, let's say, Ja'anat consider it being unmade if she were infused with cultivation's power and like remade into a new thing? Is that still unmaking? Or is that something else? Should we even call it unmaking? Or should we call it what Ja'anat calls it, which is enlightening?
Yes, she gives us that terminology, and we see it reflected in the spren that's going to bond Renarin, and we're going to talk about Renarin at the end of all of this. I think this is a good philosophical question, as you said, because I believe if we're using the terminology of made, unmade, or enlightened, then how I would define it, or what I think happened based on the statement I recently made, I think there is a making or enlightening, an elevation, an infusing of power into a spren, and then that lifts them to be made, or quote unquote enlightened. You could use either of those fairly.
Okay.
The unmaking is maybe a derogatory term because it's coming from Odium, but what fundamentally is happening is something was elevated and then it's being shifted. It's being reinfused with Odium, and that's the quote unquote unmaking.
But that's what I'm saying. I don't think unmaking is actually a thing.
I think they're the same exact process.
Yeah.
But it is about Odium could make things. He could take a lower spren and elevate them to be enlightened or made. But he's not doing that. Or Rabaniel is not trying to do that in our example of the sibling.
Yeah.
They are trying to change a made thing into something else. So maybe the elevation is harder to do.
I think it's all enlightening.
Fair. I think that is a fair reading.
Even if Odium, let's say Rabaniel was successful.
Yes.
And she infused the tower in the proper order, as it says, with void light. And she changes the sibling by doing so. We would call that unmaking, but I think that that term is kind of a red herring infused with negativity because of the past and like as a misdirection sort of. But I think even that process could be called enlightening. And we don't want it to be because like odium is bad. It can't possibly be enlightened to put void light in the sibling. But I think it is the same thing. And like if we take the emotion out of it, if we take the odium out of it, so to speak, it's all enlightening.
Okay, my counterpoint is that one is a step vertically and another is a step horizontally. They might use the same mechanisms, or if we were in the real world, you might have the same like machinery that's allowing this to happen. But I think how I would make the distinction is a made thing or an enlightened thing. I do like that terminology.
Those are two different things though, because Ja Anat, when she's enlightening, we're like so far down the rabbit hole. We haven't even talked about the Unmade yet. When Ja Anat is making changes to Spren, she's not making them. You can't say enlightening and making are the same. They're two different things.
The Spren that she is changing are already Radiant Spren, yes or no?
She can do both.
She can do the lower
lesser
Spren
and true Spren.
Okay, I would say, and this is just my opinion, I don't think it's necessarily backed up. These are just kind of like how I would define what is happening, is if you are taking a lower Spren and making them into something that is like a higher Spren, a Radiant Spren, that elevation or that step vertically is making. I won't even say enlightening at this point. I'm saying the step up
but that's
is
what I'm
making.
Saying. I don't think she is, for the lower Spren, well, or the Radiant Spren, she is not giving them a step up. She is only changing them.
Right. Yes. I think that is akin to what Odium is doing. And so from that perspective, it is the unmaking swapped with the phrase enlightened.
Right. That's what I'm saying.
Yes, I think that you're totally correct there. There's odium, but I also think there's a difference in the elevation to something new. A power jump is happening at some point, and that vertical step I think is harder, and it might even be something that odium can't do well. We know that the shards have differing abilities or how they use the power. Like cultivation is better at seeing the future, and Ruin was not great at that type of thing.
Sure. Maybe there's like a different process that we would consider something being made. Mm-hmm. But I think the two terms are made and enlightened.
Yes,
and
rather than
unmade and enlightened are synonyms.
I think we can agree with that, and it will help us going forward here as well.
Thank God.
You take the victories where you can, people. But here's a question for the audience. Let us know what you think. The made, the unmade, the enlightened. How do those terms sit with you? How do you understand them? Do you agree with Brooke and I, or the resolution that we got to? Or do you have a different interpretation? Let us know. And now we can finally move on to the unmade themselves as kind of individuals, just like we did with the heralds last.
On the subject of unmaking and kind of the process of unmaking or enlightening, as we might say, Rabaniel says that unmaking is worse than death. And the sibling then says that it's basically the same thing because unmaking destroys memory. And so if the sibling is going to be changed into a completely different person, so to speak, with new memories, you know, blank slate, basically, then the sibling as they were is dead. So it's kind of the same.
It's a moot
the sibling
point.
says, yeah, it's a moot point. Unmaking is death. Death is unmaking. I don't know why Rabaniel thinks that unmaking is even worse than death.
I would probably guess because Rabaniel has died a bunch of times before. And so to her, she's like, death is overcomeable.
Like, it's fine.
Yeah, but you can't be unmade, or you can't be remade from the unmade thing. And that might be another good distinction and drawing line is, can you be put back to how you were before? The process of enlightening might so fundamentally change you if it's destroying your memory of what you were before. And that's what the sibling is afraid of.
Yeah. Well, okay. And here maybe our discussion gets a little bit fuzzy because maybe that is the distinction between enlightening and unmaking, that when Ja Anat is enlightening a Spren, she is not removing all of the memory. Maybe. I don't know if that's true or not. I don't think we see enough of the Spren that she's enlightened to really know for sure. Gliss says that he doesn't remember very much of the process, but that could be the normal Radiant Spren. Like, Syl also doesn't have a lot of memory of the time before she's bonded with Kaladin. So it could be the same thing. It could be that Ja-Anat is enlightening in a way that doesn't remove the existing personality, whereas unmaking is an obliteration of what existed before in the creation of a new thing.
Yeah, and I think that would actually be a great bird's eye view on the situation. Shards can be extreme. If they want to obliterate all memories, they can do that. If they didn't want to obliterate all memories, they could also do that. But Ja-Anat being a thing of the natural world, though it's magical, it is, for them, part of the natural world, and therefore maybe more limited in their abilities, or saw a better path through the natural variations. And so like the shard comes in and they pave paradise, put up a parking lot. Ja-Anat like sees the patterns that already exist, and she's like making a new trail to walk through, but it's not a complete obliteration. And we simply don't have enough information right now, but I do think our speculations are putting us on the right path.
Okay, and then there's also another kind of process or possibility here. It's not just unmaking, but the unmade can also simply be trapped or kind of combated, fought. And we mostly see Shallan do this in interactions directly with the unmade. And she says that to fight an unmade or to trap the unmade, it requires empathizing with and or understanding that individual unmade.
That's such a great point. I love this call out. The concept that Shallan is enacting is with the Midnight Mother, whereas we know another unmade is eventually captured, and that one's by Dalinar, who captures the Thrill.
And Shallan interfaces with the Heart of the Revel.
Exactly. So we have one character interacting with the two unmade. We have Dalinar, and each of those unmade specifically do reflect things that Shallan is able to empathize with, or Dalinar is able to. Who knows the Thrill better than Dalinar?
Right.
The whole point of Oathbringer is nobody. That the Thrill is almost bonded to Dalinar in a way that is very different than the terminology we use for bonding. Don't want to bring up another discussion on definitions, but I believe that this is really important on Roshar, and we can see why it's important when we jump over to Sel. The Emperor's Soul involves Shai, the Soul Stamper, the Master Soul Stamper, in what I always think is a great demonstration of Brandon's hard magic system in the Cosmere. But what is it that she requires in order to stamp a new soul onto the Emperor? She needs information. She needs to understand and empathize with the Emperor. She needs to view him as a full person.
Yeah. Or any object that she stamps. People are just more complex.
More complex, but that's the thing that she is good at. She's good at the understanding and the empathizing. Whether it's a table turning into a more beautiful thing or the soul of the Emperor, she has at her fundamental level, I need to understand and empathize with the things I'm trying to change.
And in order to enact change, one must understand the thing first.
Exactly. It has to be.
I like this connection.
Right there from the beginning. Now, the process that Shai goes through with the Emperor is taking a body and stamping kind of back onto it a cognitive realm or a cognitive aspect of the Emperor. Spiritual realm too, obviously that's got to be there, but it's just a body, and she kind of pins back some of the cognitive and spiritual aspects to bring them all together. With the unmade, or with whatever process made them in the first place, you may have a spiritual and cognitive thing that doesn't have as much emphasis in the physical realm, and perhaps the shards are bringing them more into the physical realm, and kind of that's the infusion. It is bridging whatever gaps happen to exist with the Spren.
Yeah, I think we're going to get a little bit more into that thought when we talk about the individual Unmade.
So let's do that. Let's go through each of the Unmade and start with the Heart of the Revel.
Ashert Marn is the name of this spren. It's known as the Heart of the Revel, and it is considered one of the 3 mindless Unmade. So those Unmade that are on the spectrum closer to the lesser spren, not a whole lot of sentience going on here, mostly just that kind of primal emotion type spren.
Hesi's Mythica had this to say, quote, "His gift to men is not prophecy or battle focus, but a lust for indulgence," end quote. So right there we have one of the 7 deadly sins kind of on display.
Oh, kind of all of the
It is. They're all wrapped up together.
Up in one.
Yeah, I guess there's not as much clear separation into 7 deadly sins. It's just kind of like a lot of revel.
A lot of sinning. This Unmade kind of represents hedonism, debauchery, excess in many different ways. Ashartman says, quote, "Give me your passion, your hunger, your longing, your loss. Surrender it. You are what you feel," end quote. Super interesting that this is so similar to what Odium says to Dalinar, right? Like, give me your emotions.
Yes, exactly. Have it, and a little bit a freeing, which is kind of what Moash vocalizes, is he wants to, have all of the bad stuff removed so that he is free of that pain. And Dalinar
kind of the opposite, though, because it seems like Ashartman is asking them to give him these feelings, but then amplifying those feelings in them. So it's not that they are empty of their hunger, longing, loss. They are almost more full of their hunger, their passion, their longing, their loss, until they can only act on those feelings.
Yes. Again, it's almost what I was saying before, the obliteration that is possible with a shard. Moash is giving himself over to Odium, and he's left with absolutely nothing. But the natural heart of the revel is coaxing and kind of convincing people to give up their inhibitions. And then what you are remaining with is kind of like a ride and a soothing. You're not just like overwhelming the person. You're slowly encouraging or suppressing the right aspects of their personality to get the result that you want.
So the surrender is more just like, tell me all the buttons to push.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And
show me your schematic.
Yeah. And then the Unmade just pushes all the buttons until they have no executive function.
That's a great way of thinking about it. Yeah. Loss of executive function.
And the way that Shallan is able to resist the heart of the revel is by remembering kind of who she is at her core and feeling really confident in knowing who she is, knowing what is truly important to her is what enables her to resist being drawn in by the heart of the revel.
In the physical realm, it appears as an enormous dark violet heart that grows veins into the ground. Though when we say heart, it does not look like a human heart. And that is called out. It's
specifically said that it is not a human heart.
Right. So a beating, thumping organ, but not one that looks like a human heart. And I'm guessing not one that looks like the stereotypical Valentine's Day heart either.
Probably not. I'm wondering if it looks like a singer heart.
Very interesting guess there.
As for the current whereabouts of the heart of the revel, the most recent that we saw it was in Kholinar, growing over the Oathgate, which is where Shallan encounters it. And we don't know where it currently is. It flees, which is gross when you think about a large heart. How's it moving? Ugh, I don't want to think about it. But it's gone somewhere, and we do not know where yet.
I feel like this is good for the heart. We'll just leave it creepily wandering off and move over to Ba Ado Mishram, one of the more interesting and one of the Unmade we've talked and speculated quite a bit about.
And then we're going to get more information about in Wind and Truth, which is exciting. Ba Ado Mishram was considered a high princess and a commander of the enemy forces. That comes from Hesi's Mythica.
After Aharietium, she is responsible for the false desolation. We are really tied up with this idea of the false desolation. I want to know everything about it because of the consequences of everything that we see here. It's theorized that the false desolation took place at about the same time of the Recreants. Don't quite know if that was a causal relationship or a reactive situation, but about 2,000 years ago is the date of the Recreants, and so it's in that realm.
We don't really know how Ba Ado Mishram was able to accomplish the false desolation. She was somehow able to capital C connect to the singers and was therefore able to allow them forms of power and access to void light.
We may want to think of this as another analog or a mirroring of the Heralds and the Knights Radiant.
Yes.
Radiant Spren started to bond with humans to mimic the Herald powers that they saw. And it could be that Ba Ado Mishram was trying to, or was able to bond with the singers in a similar way.
Right. So sort of mimicking what Odium had done with the fused in the sort of bonding and giving of powers. Perhaps Ba Ado Mishram was like, I could do that. I'll bond with all the singers and give them powers. And then that did not work out super well.
It didn't work out, yeah, because they failed. And I am, curious about the whys and the hows of exactly what stopped a group of, theoretically, Knights Radiant, but of the singers, built of Ba Ado Mishram. Mm-hmm. Why were they not successful? Is it because they lacked the fused at that time?
The specifics are not clear, but what is said in the text kind of references the size of an Unmade as a splinter or a spren, rather than having the size and the power of a god or a shard in this point, Odium. And basically she was not big enough, powerful enough for all of the singers that were connected to her. So that was part of the downfall, but we don't have a whole lot of other details about exactly what that means and like what actually happened. What eventually ends up breaking that bond between Ba Ado Mishram and the singers is when the Knights Radiant imprison her in a gemstone. When she's imprisoned, her capital C connection to the singers is ripped away, and all of the singers are left as slave forms, except the one little group of singers who saw what Ba Ado Mishram was doing and were like, seems like a bad idea. We're going to be over here, fam. Bye. And those people became the listeners.
Yes. And to simplify and bring us back to Way of Kings, this is the Parshmen versus the Parshendi. We would call them the listeners now with more information, but that very basic distinction, why there are so many Parshmen all throughout Roshar, and why there are very small numbers of Parshendi, and then obviously we know they get killed over time with the war, but it's because of this divide that Ba Ado Mishram forced upon their people, or maybe they were cooperative as well.
I think they were like, we would like power, please.
Yes, 100%. That makes sense. People,
except for the listeners,
generally
who were like, seems sketch.
And so they pieced out, would eventually form their own society, stable society, and the imprisonment of Ba Ado Mishram severs some type of connection to all forms of power.
Right. So just like we see when Yezrian is killed with the Racium dagger and his soul is trapped inside the gemstone, that severs some kind of capital C connection to the rest of the heralds.
Yes. It's almost like what Ba Ado Mishram is doing or tried to do was some type of variation on the work of the Heralds and the Oath Pact, but at the scale of the Knights Radiant. Like, apply the powers to everyone, but I'm going to use the mechanism that I saw enacted with the Heralds.
Woof.
And that does not go well.
Bad idea.
Yeah, basically you entered into a pact with too many loopholes or variabilities, and you were attacked and overwhelmed. Yeah. And so then, just like with the Heralds, you kill one, you weaken all. Here, you imprison one, you took out almost all of the singers.
Important to note that both Nail and Kalak were present at her imprisonment, and they might know where that gemstone is currently. And then even more important are Kalak's journal entries that are put in the epigraphs of Rhythm of War. His perspective on this, I think, is something we really want to keep in mind as we go into Wind and Truth. He says, quote, "I was there when Ba Ado Mishram was captured. I know the truth of the Radiance, the Recreants, and the Nahel Spren," end quote. WTF, what does that mean?
Tell us all of your secrets.
What does this Ba Ado Mishram situation have to do with the truth of the Radiance, ? And the Recreants, and the Nahel bond itself? Like, is this whole situation perhaps revealing a weakness with the Nahel bond? Did the Radiants do the Recreants because of the Ba Ado Mishram situation? So many questions, and I think that we're going to get at least some of the answers in this next book.
Yeah, Kalak also says that the imprisonment is significant to the greater world, saying, quote, "In confining her, we have caused a greater wound to Roshar than any ever realized," end quote. And even about the idea of releasing now Ba Ado Mishram, Kalak says that it would be, quote, "for the good of all Spren," end quote. That to me, yeah. Why
would he say that?
It would be good for the listeners, because then they wouldn't have this mechanism to put them into slave form. You know, I could understand that. But for the good of all Spren is what he says.
Yeah,
and
something about Mishram being imprisoned apparently is affecting all Spren.
Right. And of course, the Knights Radiant need a Spren bond to make that relationship work. Mm-hmm. Do we know if Ba Ado Mishram needed Spren as part of the bonding process with the listeners? Like, a form of power.
She is the Spren.
Right, but a form of power does require a Spren, like to be inserted into the, or accepted into the gem heart.
Gosh, I don't know. We have too many questions. I do have some additional flavor, spice to add to this conversation, but we're going to get to that in a little bit.
Okay.
So we're going to circle back.
Yeah, before we transition out, you let me know what you think about Ba Ado Mishram. Did they use Spren to accomplish their connection to the singer? Are they the Spren and there's only one that all the singers are connected? How do you see that playing out? Now let's go on to some of the lesser known Unmade.
First, we've got Chemorish.
Excellent pronunciation.
Thank you. Just guessing.
Perfect. That's what I do all the time as well.
She is also known as the Dust Mother and is sometimes conflated with the Night Watcher. According to Hesse, the lore that surrounds this Unmade is extremely varied, so we don't really have a clear picture of their personality or power or basically anything.
Love it. I love it when it's extra confusing.
Yeah, just like this thing exists, I guess. Then we have Gonarthis, who is also known as the Black Fisher. And according to Hesse's Mythica, there is some uncertainty whether he is one of the Unmade. But if he is, then she says that it's likely that he had a hand in the scouring of Amia.
One of those background mysteries that is just eating away at my brain slowly. And I want to know what happened to Amia, which means I need to know about the Black Fisher. I also want to say that the nickname's so much cooler.
Yeah, the nicknames are great because the regular names are very hard to say.
Which is why I will only go with the nicknames. Black Fisher sounds like an awesome Unmade. I think we should be friends.
Oh, God.
And I want to know all about their history and what's going on with them. Dust Mother, Black Fisher. I think they're just out having a cup of coffee somewhere. Just chilling.
Perhaps. Then we've got Moalak, who we do see the effects of quite a bit. This is the Unmade that allows access to future sight and causes the death rattles. Quote, Moalak was said to grant visions of the future at different times, but most commonly at the transition point between realms, when a soul was nearing the Tranquiline Halls. End quote. Now, this does say that it's possible that there are other times that Moalak is granting visions of the future. When are those other times? Have we seen that happen at all? I am wondering.
I would say possibly. We do know that from Mistborn's Secret History, when Kelsier is transitioning through the cognitive realm, he remarks that madmen are uniquely exposed to the cognitive realm.
Yes.
That a person who is mad has more exposure to what's going on his side. So maybe that's an example. It's not near death, but it's when the mental aspect gets a little too chaotic. Maybe Moalak could come in there and be dropping some future sight.
I hear that. Okay. I don't hate that speculation.
I think that there's always the potential that in huge moments of investiture being used, that any one of these beings shows up. But there is something more geographic about Moalak, and the Thrill and some of these Unmade are really impacting certain areas.
Yeah, they're location based, or their power has an outer limit on the area it affects. Moalak was somewhere near Kholinar, as we see all the death rattles on the Shattered Plains and things like that. Then he took up residence in Kharbranth, which is when Taravangian is doing his death cult thing, trying to bolster the diagram. And then Moalak, for unknown reasons, relocated to the Horneater Peaks.
But we know that Rock and his family are getting word about the difficulties and the weirdness that is happening up in those Horneater Peaks. We also think it's a site of cultivation's perpendicularity. So a bunch of stuff that's happening in those peaks we hope to eventually learn about, but I don't think that's going to be something really covered in Wind and Truth.
Yeah, I think that's not happening until Rock's novella.
Sad face, but I will be happy to get some Rock up in my life.
Seemingly, the heralds can sense the Unmade. I say this because there's a point where Yezrien, kind of disguised as the beggar Ahu, tells Dalinar in Oathbringer flashbacks that he can hear that Moalak is close.
I think this is a little bit like Bronze Mistings. People who can feel is how it's described on Scadrial, but hearing.
Sense the pulses.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
I think that especially on Roshar, the more power and investiture a being has, the more sound waves they are going to give off into the spiritual realm. And so any of these beings would be like the beat of a club. Well, that's the heart of the revel. Maybe some of them have other sounds, but when you hear that like thump, 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 you know the heart of the revel is nearby. You're like, oh man, I'm going to go the other direction. I know what happens on that Friday night. I cannot do that again. I am 36 years old and I need to go to bed at a reasonable hour. And so you go the opposite direction of that sound. In this case, it happened to be Moalak. I don't want to know what death rattle sounds like, but I'll just avoid that entirely.
It's an interesting thought. Another really fascinating thing that Yezrien says during this whole conversation that he has with Dalinar is, quote, "But you know, we can't escape what we did. We let them in. We attracted them, befriended them, took them out to dance and courted them. It is our fault." End quote. This is right after he says that line about being able to hear that Moalak is close. So it almost seems like Yezrien is talking about the Unmade, that the heralds or maybe all of the original immigrants to Roshar let the Unmade in, attracted them, befriended them, etc. But the next thing he says is about like the fused or void spren torturing him. So then maybe that quote is about the fused or like the void spren. It's a little unclear, but I think it's just a little tidbit to log away in your brain.
That's a great tidbit. And I think it could be about the spren more generally, right? All of the spren, in maybe including or maybe not including the Unmade specifically. But like we attracted them. Right. That's what you do to a spren. Like you attract all of the spren.
But see, maybe this is specifically about the Unmade because we know that the humans were battle thirsty and greedy and like wanted more, which is why they leave Shinovar and start warring with the indigenous people of Roshar, the singers.
Do you think, or are you speculating that the Unmade, when they were made, it was on Ashen and they transitioned with Odium over to Roshar?
Not necessarily, but I think maybe Yezrian is saying that the actions of the humans in having battle lust and greed, etc., attracted the Unmade.
Of course.
Yeah, maybe they were on Braze, just being splinters of Odium, and then they're attracted to Roshar. Maybe just the fact that the humans were engaging in these negative behaviors at scale kind of
reinforced
built the Unmade up and gave them more power.
Yes, I think that's another great example, bringing us all the way back to the beginning. What elevates them above a normal Spren?
Yeah.
What kind of separates them from just a flame Spren? And if there is a new battle lust probably existed with the listener community or with any other beings across Roshar. But if you then introduce someone who is screaming and calling out and lusting for battle at all times, then the Spren that was just kind of a amorphous blob gets focused and gets more power. And on Roshar, that power comes with investiture, and investiture can create sentience. And so over time, you get the Unmade. Maybe the humans are the one who made them rather than the shards.
Sure.
Like the thing that does the elevating is the humans.
Yeah.
And then when they are of a certain power, Odium stepped in and was like, you're mine now. And I'm going to enlighten you. I'm going to change your focus from being on the humans to following Odium.
Interesting thoughts. Okay, since we've talked about it so much, the Thrill, aka Nergaul.
The Thrill.
This is considered one of the more mindless Spren, which kind of undercuts the argument we were just making, because I would think this would be one of the ones that was super powered up by humans and then would gain more sentience, which doesn't seem to be the case. So, as always, we could be completely wrong.
Probably are, but I like the idea of the broad base of power versus kind of more narrow focused. And the Thrill can and does impact everyone in a sphere and seems to have...
Does not take sides.
Right, exactly. Kind of doesn't have that choosing element. It's just a natural force. And some could say the Stormfather at a time was like that. It was just the Spren of the natural forces.
Yeah.
It no longer is.
I mean, the Stormfather is kind of a bad example because it's
not
a completely different thing.
Yes, I agree. But maybe the Night Watcher, maybe the Sibling are better comparisons. And what I think is important to remember about the Thrill is that it has this appearance of a red mist filling people's minds, or even the mist itself, with images of battle, death, gore, and the dying that it kind of is predicting. It's not future sight in the same way. It's a little bit like memory, kind of bringing up the images of the past battles that have been fought because of the Thrill.
Yeah. And then, of course, the Thrill, during the Battle of Thaylen Field, it is captured inside the King's Drop Ruby by Dalinar. And then that perfect gemstone gets sunk to the bottom of the ocean.
A good place for it. I am very happy with their decision there. One of the worst things would have been like, let's use this for our own benefit.
Right. Or even like, we'll just keep it in our treasury or whatever. Like, no. Put it somewhere that no one, or people are going to have a really hard time finding it and getting it back.
Definitely true. I'm curious if there is a cognitive realm aspect of...
Yes. I mean, there has to be.
Right, because they're like Spren.
I'm constantly thinking about this. Like, what is the upside down version of this? What is it like on the other side?
Because if it's at the bottom of the ocean, it should be a really big mountain in the cognitive realm.
In Shadesmar.
Yes. And at the very, very top of that mountain, there should be the King's Drop Ruby in some
form.
Or
some kind of prison that the Thrill is inside of.
Exactly.
So theoretically, that would probably be the best way to get the thrill back, should someone want to, would be to
I would
go
agree.
into Shadesmar and find it there.
Yeah, don't try to go to the bottom of the ocean.
That's going to be hard.
Y'all don't have submarines. We've just got James Cameron and like 4 other billionaires die every time they try to go down into the ocean. It's hard. Don't do it.
Moving on to our next Unmade, we have Re-Shafir, also known as the Midnight Mother or the Spawning Mother. We've talked about her quite a bit in relation with other things. She takes the form of this mass of kind of a black, tarry substance that can flow over any surface, and it appears to have screaming faces that kind of bubble up to the surface.
Truly horrifying, but we've had so much speculation about the Midnight Mother in relationship to the Midnight Essence,
right,
and the Midnight Spores or the Midnight Aether, like all of that aspect from Tress of the Emerald Sea. We're getting really excited about what it means over there, and there is always Re-Shafir here on Roshar being the source.
Know that, yeah, just like we've been talking about some of the other Unmade being manifestations of kind of a physical force or power, we know that Midnight Essence is a fundamental material aspect of the Cosmere.
Re-Shafir is able to spawn midnight creatures, and they're made of her essence, that black tarry substance. And those creatures are one of the first things that Dalinar sees and fights in his flashbacks in The Way of Kings.
We hear, quote, "The Midnight Mother created monsters of shadow and oil, dark imitations of creatures that she saw or consumed. Their description matches no Spren I can find in modern literature," end quote. That's from the Mythica. I think the thing to take out of this is that the creatures that the Midnight Mother is spawning are imitations of what she sees.
Yeah, she's not necessarily creating something new, but this black tar is so interesting to me. When we were discussing Yumi and the Nightmare Painter, the nightmares there, and discussing the shroud, it's kind of said to be, a black substance, kind of the remnants of whatever the Great Father Machine did on that planet. It's kind of like the exhaust fumes or the pollution of that situation. And from it come the nightmares. And they're made up of, connected to that shroud essence. In the same way, the midnight creatures are connected to their creator in Tress. She can use the midnight spores to create one of these little scary nightmare moppets and has the ability to control them, which can be severed with Silver Dagger. Fun facts, kids. I think that Re-Shafir's connection to these other midnight things across the Cosmere will really help us understand what's going on those planets as well.
The Midnight Mother is, I believe, the first Unmade that Shallan encounters, and Shallan, after interacting with the Midnight Mother and understanding that the Midnight Mother is imitating what she sees, is doing a mimicry, Shallan wonders if the Midnight Mother may have at one point been human.
That would be the darkest path of all of these things.
It would be really dark.
Because I am so tied up with the elevation, right, of all of these different Spren into made creatures.
Sure.
But what if it's a deconstruction? What if it's more akin to kind of what the Lord Ruler does with his creation of Kolos and the mist wraiths into Khandra? It's a little bit more rough and dark.
Yes. And don't we hear that the Lord Ruler goes through those creations kind of in sequence? He's practicing, and
Testers.
The Kolos are like the first, or maybe it's the Mythrace. One of them are the first one, and he's like, that didn't really work out. It just kind of made this weird blob thing. I'm wondering what if the Unmade were like the first attempt at making heralds and honored cultivation, where like, here, we'll give you a bunch of power and like basically make you a Spren. And that did not work out super well. And that is kind of what the heralds are, right? They're like super invested. They are cognitive shadows.
They're bound to the shards.
And as you're saying, or you've speculated about a lot, they are influenced by people's perceptions and thoughts about them in the same way that Spren are. So what if the Unmade are just the first pancake?
Yeah, just slightly awkwardly shaped and a little confused. Now, do you think that Odium eventually comes in and throws his chocolate chips in that pancake mix?
Yes.
For all of the chocolate chip lovers and their pancakes, they're shouting now at us. But I think that this is true in some version. I don't know what the exact mechanics are, but I definitely think that all of these, just like the Honor Blades get copied and mimicked to become Spren Blades and the Radiant Blades, those die to become the Shard Blades. The Shard Blades are seen by the 5 Scholars, so they make Nightblood. Azure sees Nightblood, so makes her, it's just down and down the list, copies on copies on copies.
Right.
And I think you eventually do get into the same process of making, same process of creation that all of these shards are capable of, but we're seeing how they enacted it and how they do that in their given fields.
Yeah.
And there's overlap now with Odium and Cultivation and Honor and what was naturally on Roshar. And so it looks confusing because none of them are true creations. I think they're all taking from what's around and adding a little bit of their own spice. So in my estimation, I think the Unmade kind of start as Spren, get elevated in some way. So they're now top tier Spren and could be called the Made. But you're left with, if that's possible, what else is possible? And if they did create the Made first as little testers, maybe they got to a point when they were like, hey, we don't even need to elevate an existing Spren. We can make our own. Cultivation and Honor can get down and dirty and can make ourselves a little baby of our own. And they have the sibling.
Okay,
Then you have all of these copies where they're saying like, well, we don't want to make any more Made because those could be turned or they're weird, but I know how to do this thing and I'm going to now enact it with the heralds because I need a specific task done. And so like once they learn the secret of creation, they keep using it in different formats.
I think that's the cool thing and the benefit of having a hard magic system or a world that has really well-defined rules is that we can say, we know that even though a lot of these things look different on their face, they're all functioning on the same underlying principles and mechanics, which can help us get to the root of things and means that everything is at least somewhat related.
So the Midnight Mother, before the Recreants infiltrated Urithiru, was captured by a Lightweaver at that time. Imprisoned in the same way as the Thrill is now? Maybe. We don't know what like the capturing means, but yes, stuck in the sibling. After the Recreants, something broke and allowed Midnight Mother to escape. But
she was still chilling at Urithiru until Shallan finds her.
Yes.
And then she runs away.
I'm very worried why things can escape their imprisonment. I don't like that thought.
That's fair.
I want them to, if I put them in a prison, then I want them to stay in the prison. But seemingly once she escaped imprisonment, she didn't leave Urithiru.
Yeah. I feel like she was feeling safe where she was at because there was no one at Urithiru.
Yeah, for a very, very long time.
I'm just going to hang out here.
Yeah, no danger of being imprisoned again if there's no people around to imprison you.
Exactly. And just as an example of how in-world people don't know everything, Hessie writes that the Midnight Mother was destroyed at Odium. So clearly she was wrong. And I think we should be asking ourselves, what else was Hessie wrong about?
After the confrontation with Shallan, much like the Revel, the Midnight Mother flees. We don't know about their location, though at some point she's reported to the Fused or told the Fused about what is going on. And at that time incorrectly says that the sibling is dead.
Yeah.
Don't know why, if that was a mistake or if it was purposeful.
Right. Yeah.
Are they friends now? Are they working in cahoots?
Like, I was hanging out with a sibling for a long time.
Yeah.
We're BFFs.
Basically, it's like, it's my cousin. Maybe it was at one time my actual sibling. We reconnected as adults. We became best friends and then goes out and like tells on this. I call bogus on that situation. I think that there's something a lot more important going on with the Midnight Mother, and is one of the more cognitively powerful or cognitively purposeful, we'll say, of the Unmade. I would say we have more to learn about the Midnight Mother. Can you tell me about Yelignar?
Yelignar, called the Blightwind.
Another excellent nickname.
Yes. In the text, Yelignar is described as being able to speak like a man, but often his voice is accompanied by the wails of, quote, those he consumed, end quote.
Not a fun guy at parties, is what I'm learning.
Yeah, sounds bad. And then the text goes on to say, quote, Yelignar is said to consume souls, but I can't find a specific explanation. I'm uncertain if this lore is correct, end quote. We, of course, see Yelignar a couple of different times, possessing various people. He seems to live inside of a gemstone, but is not trapped in the gemstone. It's just his physical aspect, seemingly.
Yeah, it's the difference between the genie being bound to the lamp and a genie who just likes hanging out in lamps.
That's a really good explanation.
For all you millennials, that explanation will strike a chord and ring real true.
It's perfect.
So Yelignar likes to hang out in gemstones. When you consume that gemstone,
Yelignar consumes you.
Yeah, well, as part of that process, it is a consuming that happens from within, and the person is empowered with surges and surge binding. Not just one either, seemingly a variety of different surges.
Yeah, the theory is that the person would have access to 9 surges, theoretically not, quote, Honor's truest surge. I have some questions about this. This is basically what the Coppermind says, but I think there's more nuance here, because the first person we see possessed by Yelignar is Azadin, the Alethi Queen, Elikar's wife. And when she is possessed, she appears completely normal, but her personality is off. She's very cruel. She's not behaving like herself at all. I think we might see her use a little bit of power, but basically she looks normal, and it's not clear that she is being possessed by an Unmade. However, we next see Amaram possessed by Yelignar, and he looks completely different.
Monstrous.
His eyes glow red. He starts growing crystals out of his body. He's wreathed in this black wind that's whipping around. He's using all the powers. So I'm not sure what the difference is, if it's just up to the Unmade, and the Unmade, different things were more useful to the Unmade at a different time, perhaps.
And it's really whatever the person that they embed themselves inside of might have a vessel-like quality, a shard and vessel-like quality.
So they have some control?
Not necessarily control, but the guiding path. Amaram wants power. He wants to fully display and dominate.
Yeah.
And so he becomes the monstrous version. Asudan, or how did you say her name?
Azadin?
Okay. However it suits you, dear listener, has no real desire for that type of display of power, but wants control and certainly wants to be obeyed, and has a corrupting from within that is slower and takes more time. And so maybe their vessel-like influence is felt on Yelignar.
Yeah. And supposedly the people that he possesses will eventually be completely consumed by Yelignar.
Once again, I am left with a connection over to the Aethers. This sounds very much like the Spore Eaters.
Yeah.
Yelignar is being consumed. The spores get inside of the people. They will eventually kill them all. Nobody survives. Nobody survives Yelignar. There's an amount of power that is bestowed upon the people. Questionable about how that power is displayed, but certainly out of the Captain Crow, there's like all of this spidery web stuff that blocks bullets and catches swords and whatnot. And so I think if we had anything that really felt to me like a cross comparison, Spore Eater and Yelignar's victims are pretty good ones.
Yeah, I like that. In another example of reasons why we shouldn't trust everything we read in the books, according to Hessie, Jasnah has specifically expressed doubt about the existence of Yelignar to her scholar friends. So maybe this is the only time that Jasnah was wrong, but we can confidently say that at least one time Jasnah is wrong.
And it is a good reminder that Hessie is not an ancient writer.
Yes,
a
correct.
contemporary of Jasnah means that she's around, or at least was around not that long ago.
Recently, yeah. Okay, we have come to kind of the star of the show, Sja-anat. She's also known as the Taker of Secrets, and she received that name a long time ago from a scholar.
Physically, she takes the form of a jet black shadow that points the wrong way with white holes for eyes. And the description goes like this, quote, shadows and mist, Odium's pure essence, end quote.
Seeing her requires reflected light, so she is often seen in mirrors. In the mirror, she appears as a woman with waist-length black hair and a kind of archaic dress. She's got this tunic type thing that's belted at the waist, and she is quite intelligent, but she doesn't consider herself the most clever of the Unmade.
A real Ishar situation. Right in the middle is how they define themselves. But I think that the intelligence and kind of what is on display from Sja-anat might bring into question if she is the most clever of the Unmade. We know that her main ability is to corrupt or enlighten Spren, and she, quote, shows them a different path that is possible, end quote.
That's how she describes what enlightening is, showing Spren that a different path is possible. I find this incredibly intriguing.
Is that because you would say the path that has been shown to them is the one with honor and cultivation and the oaths?
Yes. So it is the thing that makes Honor Spren think that they are Honor Spren and they must behave in a specific way, because they are Honor Spren. Sja-anat can come in and provide, I think, more individuality, perhaps, to an individual Spren and sort of get them out of the group think that we see a lot of the Radiant Spren types engaging in.
But notably, not the Radiant Spren that do the bonding. They're weirdos in their society. That, like, Pattern is more adventurous than others of his kind. And it's said to be similar with most of the Radiant Spren that are actually bonded.
But Pattern still comes to bond after, like, a consortium of cryptics is assembled and they, like, talk about it and decide that they'll take the risk, and Pattern wants to, and so they send Pattern. And it's kind of the same thing with Windle, where there's like a group of Spren. It happens a little bit differently from type of Spren to type of Spren, because they all have slightly unique ways of governing themselves, but we hear similar stories each time. Sometimes it really is one Spren that's like, I'm doing what I want. I think that the best example of that is actually Jasnah's Spren, Ivory.
Yes, exactly.
Who really specifically says, like, my kind is real mad at me for being here and, like, bonding someone.
And I feel like in The Sunlit Man, we have the second Spren of Nomad, who we would know as Auxiliary, says, my type, my kind, are too conservative, basically. You know, they don't take enough risk. I wanted this bond, and I wanted to take these actions.
I'm going to come back to Ox in a little bit.
I love it.
Because I think there's a chance that Ox is an enlightened Spren.
Ooh! I would also say one of the best descriptions of someone who is enlightened, or the process of enlightening, is recognizing various paths when you think there's only one.
Right.
I think that's just a great understanding of what it means to be enlightened. It's just the burst of atium that allows you to see all the possible paths before you, and then you get to choose the one.
And then you get to choose.
Yes.
Yeah. I am kind of obsessed with Ja-Anat and this whole situation. I'm kind of on board. Like, I'm kind
Ja-Anat
of
for president.
Team Ja-Anat. Yeah.
Let's do it. Tell me some more about Ja-Anat and historically.
Historically, the Knights Radiant believed that she was only capable of corrupting the lesser Spren, but we see that that's not true. She is capable of enlightening the Radiant Spren as well. And again, showing them that they can be different. They can do something different. They can behave differently. She says that during the time between returns, she mostly just sleeps because, quote, without her connection to Odium, it's hard to think, end quote. So seemingly there's a similarity here between something like a Nahel bond and the Unmade and Odium, because the Radiant Spren also say that when they are not bonded, they have less sentience, they have less ability to think, they have less ability to remember. So I think that's a good thing to note and kind of factor into our thoughts about what the Unmade are and how they function. When Odium's power is able to manifest more strongly on Roshar, like during the Desolations, it gives more power and more sentience to the Unmade.
She also calls Odium the god of all adopted Spren. And I don't know what she means by adopted Spren.
What does this mean? My question was like, were the Unmade large Spren that were kind of like cast away, and then Odium's like, I'll take you, unmakes them and like makes them his own little Spren?
Or are they adopted by, I mean, I think the casting out is true, but like, who's doing the adopting? Odium is doing the adopting?
Yeah.
Or is it Honor and Cultivation that did the adopting originally and then did the casting out, which is why the god, like, I know father and god is always combined and connected in a very strange way, especially in the Western world, but I feel a difference between a father and a god. And if I'm saying the god of adopted Spren, to me, that means that all adopted Spren or all adopted children.
But what does that mean? What's an adopted Spren?
I think someone else did the adopting.
No, I think you're completely wrong. I think that Odium is adopting them, and sort of the way that he is signing the adoption papers, so to speak, is by unmaking,
right?
Perhaps enlightening them. Either word you want to use, he's infusing them with some of his power and kind of saying like, okay, you're mine now. And
that is something that Ja-Anat can then do to other Spren.
Yes.
And I think that ability, just like so much of what we've talked about today, it's a reflection and a mirroring. It was done to her, which means she knows it can be done to someone else or another Spren in this case.
Yeah, because she calls the Spren that she enlightens her children. She says at this point that she is a double agent, that she's secretly working against Odium. So coming back to this idea that splinters have agency, are able to, in this case, work against, maybe you would call him their creator. I think that's up for debate. But they have a splinter of Odium, and they are able to work against Odium or not work for his purposes because they have agency. Ways in which she does this, she sends her children, the enlightened Spren, Gliss and Tumi, to bond allies of the Knights Radiant, and she has more enlightened Spren waiting in the wings, willing to bond. Interestingly, Tumi is originally intended for Mraize. So I do think we need to keep in mind that although she says she's a double agent, she's working against Odium, that doesn't necessarily mean she's working for all of the purposes we want her to be working towards.
Yes. It doesn't mean she's with Dalinar and our main crew.
Exactly.
It means she's against Odium.
Exactly, yeah.
And I think that really fuzzes the line of a double agent. Be like, that's not a double agent. You're just working for yourself. You're just another agent. A double agent is like you are pretending to work for them, but you are working for me. In this case, she's like, nah, I'm a rogue agent. She's just out there causing chaos.
Yeah. To be fair, I don't think she actually says the words double agent. She just says, like, I'm not your enemy.
She's 007. I get it. She's James Bond. That's actually her name. She's going to walk out, do the little quick turn to the side, hit you with some investiture, enlighten that magic, drip down in the red corruption.
She also saves Shallan et al. From death while they are traveling through the Kholinar Oathgate. She has corrupted the Spren of the Oathgate. And when Shallan's like, sorry, man, my party really wants to go into this Oathgate, she's like, I'll try not to kill you. Which I guess she didn't have to do. She could have let them die in the corrupted Oathgate, but she didn't. She saved them. So,
and yeah, okay, so is this a saving or a not saving? Is this a helping or a not helping? Because she also sends corrupted Windspren to Taravangian as a way to lure Odium into the presence of Nightblood, which then the sword is used to destroy Rhaesa and allows Taravangian to take up the shard and become Teravodium.
Right. So again, she has her own agenda, her own purposes, her own things that she thinks are going to be beneficial for her, most likely. I don't know if we would say, thanks for putting Taravangian in the Shard of Odium.
Yeah, but seemingly it was what Cultivation was working for all along. So if Cultivation's playing the long game with all of these major pieces, whew, girl, you have some good notes. You've been taking some notes, and then you were just like, I'll see how this plays out. And then it has played out exactly as you expected. Maybe. We'll see. Now, we do also know that Ja'anat wants to be a god unto herself.
Yes.
And I think this is where a lot of hesitation should be entered into the system. Maybe you don't want to join Ja'anat's team because that's a recipe for more destruction, more fighting, more I want to be a god, but you want to be a god, and so we need to clash.
Yeah. I think there's a question about what she really means about being a god unto herself. Does she just kind of want freedom to use her power in the way that she wants to instead of feeling pressured by Odium to do what he wants her to?
I don't think that's what a god means.
Yeah, is she really trying to accumulate followers and power, etc.?
Yeah, and wants to use that power on other people as power has been used upon her.
I don't know. Right now I like her. I'm giving her the benefit of the doubt.
That's totally fair. It's all good to give the benefit of the doubt. But the people you would need to ask are the Spren that she is corrupting. Because if they're
cool with it.
I know, they seem cool with it. And
yes.
they seem it's a positive thing, which I think that would help us define if she's doing a good thing or a bad thing. If they were like, I feel imprisoned, like the listeners in slave form feel imprisoned, and they're like slamming to get out, that would be bad.
I would not. She's saying that she is giving them more agency.
Yes,
which
and
I'm
they're choosing a new path. And I agree, if that's what's happening. But we can't believe Hessia, we can't believe anyone. And so I'm definitely not going to believe the Unmade.
I think we should dive into her creations and the fruit of her labors to add to this discussion.
Yeah,
because we have examples. We have Gliss, one of the Enlightened Spren of Ja'anat, who has bonded Renarin.
I think this will help conclude everything that we've talked about, and it serves as perhaps the best example of so much of what we've been introducing today. Renarin, the game breaker, as we have previously called him. Renarin, the redacted one, the one who seemingly is moving in the background and perhaps has better vision himself than others have of him. What is Gliss's role with Renarin and therefore with the Knight Radiant?
So Gliss was a Mist Spren, but he has, now that he's been enlightened, he has a different appearance than a typical Mist Spren. I think that this brings up some questions. If Ja'anat's influence creates a new kind of Spren, would we still call Gliss a Mist Spren? Would he be something completely else? Does he need a new name, a new type? Or is he simply a subcategory of Mist Spren, the Enlightened Mist Spren? I'm not sure, and I don't think we have the answer yet, but something to be thinking about. A typical Mist Spren has the appearance of a collection of shimmering lights, like when a light reflects through a crystal. And when the Spren is still, not moving, the light grows up in the shape of plants. I think this indicates that there could be a stronger affiliation with cultivation in the Mist Spren, which kind of makes sense because they provide access to progression or regrowth.
Now, without defining them as an entirely new type of Spren, we'll just call Gliss for now a corrupted Mist Spren or an enlightened Mist Spren, and his appearance, as well as Tumi's appearance, is of red crystalline shapes similar to snowflakes, which light kind of forms and drips upward from. A very strange description, and the times things are going backwards. I don't like when the shadows go the wrong way. I don't like when light drips upward. That's wrong. Drips go down. They start with a D. This is the only way I can categorize my world. Drips down.
Gliss is changed before he bonds Renarin, and he does not remember the process of being changed. He doesn't remember a whole lot of his life before that. But we do know that Mist Spren enjoy seeing the world in new ways. That's one of the kind of core personality aspects of Mist Spren as a group. And this might make them particularly suited for Ja'anat's enlightening. If she's like, hey, let me show you a new path. And she's talking to someone who's already predisposed to enjoy seeing new things, learning new things, getting a new perspective.
That's very interesting. I didn't think of the Spren themselves as being more or less open to the suggestions of Ja'anat. And so maybe she's working with the Mist Spren because they're the ones who were predisposed to answer those inquiries with like, oh, that sounds intriguing to me. I'll go learn from you.
Yeah. And then there are powers that come from this bond between Gliss and Renarin. Through his bond with Gliss, Renarin has access to the Truth Watcher powers of progression and illumination. Other Truth Watchers are able to create illusions like Lightweavers, but Renarin is not, at least at this point, able to fully create illusions like Shallan is able to. He's only able to summon lights, and they're described as doing, quote, strange, unnatural things sometimes, end quote. We don't know what the in-world people consider to be strange, unnatural things.
But we do know what Tyler thinks are strange and unnatural, and that's dripping upwards.
Yeah, that's probably it.
So things along those lines.
Light doing weird stuff.
Renarin's perhaps most important unique power is this access to future sight. I am still confused. Is this the truly something that is unique only for Renarin? Is it an advanced ability that the Enlightenment is allowing Renarin to access before he otherwise would as a Truth Watcher? Like, is what Renarin's doing with Future Sight, is that actually level 5 Truth Watcher Radiant power, but he's getting it at level 1, sometimes in a scary or overwhelming fashion because he doesn't have the maturity that you're supposed to have to be able to see the future? Or is it entirely not something that any Truth Watcher will ever be able to do unless you're enlightened? I don't know.
The reactions of people in world
are bad.
I think has led us to believe that this is a unique thing that Truth Watchers are not supposed to be able to do, that he is able to do because of his bond with an enlightened Spren. It is said that Future Sight is of Odium, and so the reason that he has access to that is because Gliss has a little bit of Odium. And then more than just being able to see the future in a way, a increase in power level from that is that he and Gliss can remember or replay these visions if they focus on it. But, of course, the visions can be wrong.
Yeah, and I think that's not a great thing. I don't think replaying, in his mind, he thinks Yasna is going to kill him in Oathbringer.
Right.
And replaying that over and over again, I don't think is healthy for young Renarin. I think,
well, but it's helpful like later on when Dalinar is like, oh, tell me about your vision. And he's like, oh, actually, I can show
just
you.
Replay it. Yeah. And I so badly want to know more about what it is to be a truth watcher versus an enlightened truth watcher. Only a small bit for selfish reasons.
I know you just want to know because you want your RPG character to have future sight.
I am wondering if he would have future sight.
I don't think so.
I don't know at all. And I don't think we have enough in-world evidence because the truth watchers are specifically called out to be a group that never writes down anything that they are doing. They almost have an aversion to explaining what is going on within their order in the ancient past. And so anything that we know about their powers, we're just learning for the first time.
Yeah. I do have a question about why would the Truth Watchers be so cagey about talking about what they did?
Because it scares people.
If regular Truth Watchers were not able to see the future.
Exactly.
Then
They
why
wouldn't
would
hide
they be
it.
so cagey?
Right.
Yeah. But then it makes sense to me that this would be a special Renarin power. So we don't know. We don't have a lot of evidence about it at all. I don't know if we're going to get that much more evidence in it in this book because Renarin is going to be a point of view character in the back half.
We would only, I think, be learning something via Ja'ana, where we started. Like, we could learn through Renarin.
Or Relaine, because Relaine bonds to me.
I think we could learn mechanisms that way through the two Truth Watchers, or we could backdoor understand something by a revelation about Ja'ana and understand more about the enlightening process. I'm scared. I'm worried about the whole, I don't remember what happened to me. I know that's kind of a Spren thing, but
it's also an unmaking thing.
Yes.
It gets rid of memories.
Right.
Yeah.
Not a fan of either one at the starting point.
Other unique abilities that Renarin has because of this enlightened bond. Gliss is able to hide himself inside of Renarin's body.
Very strange.
Which is unique.
Yeah,
we
pattern.
don't see any other Spren do that.
Exactly. Always kind of like on the outside of things.
Right.
And viewable.
And then also, Gliss and Renarin are able to communicate mind to mind. We don't see this happen with Shallan or with Kaladin. They both have to speak out loud to their Spren. Yasna as well has to speak out loud to Ivory. I'm wondering if this is our clue for the Sunlit Man. Perhaps Ox was enlightened prior to his death, and that's why he and Sigil are able to speak mind to mind.
Interesting. Would you say that the Stormfather can speak into people's mind? He does so with Dalinar. He does so multiple times when he's like talking to him. It's not said to be an actual sound because Dalinar freaks out.
Sometimes it is.
Sometimes I think it is, but oftentimes Dalinar freaks out and like turns around and is like, do you hear that voice? And everyone's like, no. So it's not an actual sound. It's
I know,
in his
but
mind.
you keep bringing up the Stormfather, and the Stormfather is not a regular Spren.
Oh, it's not a regular Spren, but he is a Spren. And
he's a Spren plus a cognitive shadow, though.
I know, but I'm trying to establish, like, what are these different beings doing? Do you think that the Stormfather is speaking mind to mind? I would say yes.
Yeah, at least some of the time.
Exactly. And so perhaps that is something that requires greater connection, greater...
You think Renarin is just like a super high level Radiant?
No, I think that Gliss is basically unlocking
Gliss is just like
abilities.
More powerful.
Yeah, more powerful. I don't know. It's the same question. I think that there might be an aspect of skipping over some of the rules that are traditionally established with the orders and following the specific rules for the specific tiers of power.
It seems kind of lame that would be the cool thing about having an Enlightened Spren is just like, you get early access. I find that a lot less exciting than like actually having unique powers. Yeah.
I guess from my perspective, I just think that it's somewhat more naturalistic rather than saying you have to go through this strict hierarchy to reach this level. It's like saying you have to go through each grade of math to understand calculus, but you can understand calculus learning it in a holistic manner. And maybe that's what enlightenment from Ja'anat is. It's knowing how to access your powers in a holistic fashion.
Let me just bring this back to like really concrete terms.
Yeah.
Because a typical Radiant has access to some power of honor and some power of cultivation through this bond. Because the Enlightened Spren are enlightened, they also have some of Odium's power, meaning that their Radiant will have access to some of Honor's power, some of Cultivation's power, and some of Odium's power. So there is going to be different powers that come along with having that connection to Odium.
And there should be different resonance points with those powers, right?
Right. Yeah.
Because it's a three-body problem instead of just the two. And so I would imagine, you have two existing, you add the third, the resonance point has to shift to be in the middle of the three rather than in the middle of the starting two.
Right. Yeah. More evidence for the reason why I think maybe Ja'anat is cool and the Enlightened Spren are a good thing. Ivory, Jasnah's Spren, says that the bond between Renarin and Gliss, quote, is right, end quote. This is when they are coming upon Renarin when Jasnah is like about to kill him. And then Ivory is like, no, actually, this is right. I'm curious. Okay, like we just said, Radiant Spren are a combo of honor and cultivation. But now that Odium is a true tone of Roshar, maybe Odium's power needs to be incorporated into the Spren and into the magic system in order for things to work properly. Would a full-scale enlightening help combat the kinds of maybe unproductive behavior or thought patterns? For example, what we see with the honor Spren in Lasting Integrity, like kind of not acting honorably. Would being enlightened kind of help bring everything back into balance? Because essentially the magic system is not accounting for the new true presence of Odium. Similar to how in Elantris, the Aeon, right, like the base Aeon
redrawn,
needs to be updated to
accounted.
Reflect the new state of things.
I think that's a wonderful call. I like the concept of balance, and what we are dealing with is an unbalanced system.
Yeah, like things are not behaving as they should because we're not factoring in the third true tone of Roshar. We're still acting like it's a two-shard system, and it's not.
Love that call. You're kind of a genius. I think that we have a little bit more that we can discuss and bring into the conversation, but I want you, dear listener, to let me know what you think about this. Ja'anah, Renarin, Gliss, True Tones of Roshar. Do you think that there needs to be a rebalancing among all of the Spren and the humans and the singers and the listeners and just everybody? Anybody who's out there, we need to rebalance the way that they're thinking about everything from a fundamental kind of philosophical point. Does a rebalancing need to be done? Hit me with one last connection between the Spren and Odium.
One more little kind of callback in language here. During that confrontation between Jasnah and Renarin in Oathbringer, Renarin and Gliss see a vision of Dalinar giving in to Odium, and they despair. They're really sad about what they think is going to be an inevitable outcome. And Gliss says, quote, "He will not be resisted. My sorrow, Renarin, I will give you my sorrow," end quote. So again, super reminiscent of what Odium is asking of Dalinar. Give me your emotions. Is this a real thing that Gliss can do? Is this just a turn of phrase that he has sort of picked up by having some of Odium in him, that he's like mimicking the language here? Is this a power of an enlightened Spren? I have so many questions, but I think that there is at least some significance between this repetition in language of the enlightened Spren, the Unmade, and Odium.
That's a great call out. And the line is saying, I will give you my sorrow. Gliss is saying that to Renarin.
Yes, correct.
Which is the opposite of Odium's position. I will take your pain.
Right.
I want you to give me your sorrow so you don't experience it, Dalinar or Moash. So why would Gliss be giving his sorrow to Renarin? That seems
Yeah.
backwards in a way.
What would that do?
Right.
What is he trying to do there?
And is it, oh man, this gets us into the loopholes, the rabbit holes, the black holes, the singularities of everything that is going on. It's kind of swirling around these questions of, do we understand and recognize what is being said and what we are reading, what we are consuming? Or are we making mistakes and assumptions that kind of Brandon wants us to make? You know, he's leading us down that route. You're supposed to see a similarity between the language of Odium and the language of Gliss, which is supposed to make you feel a little worried and hesitant. But in reality, it's the opposite. So maybe it's actually a good thing. Yeah. But Brandon's trying to disguise it. This is too meta. It was too high. It's too low. I don't know which one, but it's inside out and it's backwards. And I feel like that's what we're dealing with these Enlightened Spren. They do not make sense. It's like that description of Hoid.
I think they're great. I'm on board.
You're fully on board. Yeah, you've talked yourself into the love of the Enlightened Spren.
Yeah, and taking notes for this episode, I completely convinced myself. The research convinced me.
Exactly. Yeah. You didn't convince yourself.
The research. And I did a lot of research for this episode.
As you can tell by the now multiple hours we have put into this episode, thank you so much for staying along with all of our craziness and our heavy amounts of speculation. It came with a good dose of research, and I think all of these questions are significant. So exciting leading up to Wind and Truth. We're going to get some answers, but these are good, solid questions.
Such good questions. I can't wait to have conversations about all of these things with y'all on our social media and over on Patreon in the Discord, which has been a total blast lately. And until next time, life before death,
strength before weakness,
journey before destination.